The night of the charity gala, I wore heels I couldn't afford and smiled at people whose names I immediately forgot. That was my job. Associate Fundraising Coordinator at the Vancouver Art Gallery, which sounds impressive until you realize it mostly means I spent my evenings making sure wealthy donors didn't run out of champagne. I remember thinking the evening was going well. I remember the orchestra playing something I recognized but couldn't name. I remember a man across the room watching me with the kind of patience that felt deliberate, like he'd decided to do it and wasn't going to stop. I don't remember much after midnight. What I do remember is waking up. White ceiling, not my ceiling. My ceiling has a water stain shaped like the Italian peninsula that I've been meaning to report to my landlord for 8 months. This ceiling was perfect, coffered, the kind of ceiling that existed in buildings with concierges and underground parking and doormen who remembered your name. I sat up and immediately regretted it. My head felt like someone had relocated my brain 3 inches to the left and hadn't bothered to tell me. I was wearing a silk slip, ivory, delicate, definitely not mine because the nicest thing I owned to sleep in was a university t-shirt that said Go Thunderbirds on it. The sheets were the kind of high thread count that felt like water. The room was quiet in the way that expensive rooms are quiet, soundproofed, deliberate. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the North Shore Mountains through early morning fog, which meant I was still in Vancouver, which was the only piece of information I had that felt solid. I found my dress from the night before folded neatly over a chair, my shoes beside it, paired like someone had arranged them on purpose, my bag on the dresser, contents apparently untouched. "You're awake." I spun around so fast I nearly fell off the bed. He was standing in the doorway to what I assumed was a sitting room, holding a coffee mug, dressed in a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Late 30s. The kind of face that looked like it had decided at some point to stop being conventionally handsome and settled instead for something more unsettling. Dark eyes, a jaw that hadn't been shaved in 2 days, the general posture of someone who had never once waited in a line. I knew who he was. Everyone at the gallery knew who he was. Kellen Voss. Not the Bennett Voss on the donor wall, the one whose grandfather had made his money in forestry and his father in real estate, and who now sat on boards and cut ribbons at hospital wings. That was his uncle. Kellen was the one nobody talked about directly, the name that surfaced in conversations, only when people thought they were being discreet. The kind of man that made other wealthy men speak carefully. Where am I? My voice came out steadier than I felt, which surprised me. My apartment. He took a sip of coffee like this was unremarkable. 42nd floor. You've been asleep for about 6 hours. Why am I in your apartment? Because you agreed to be here. I stared at him. I stopped. My memory of the previous night had the texture of something that had gotten wet and dried wrong. The gala. The champagne, though I was certain I'd had only 2 glasses. I was always careful about that at work events. The man watching me from across the room. A conversation that had started because he'd asked me something about the exhibition we were fundraising for, and I'd answered because it was literally my job to talk to donors. And then, gaps. Not blackout gaps, exactly. More like a film with scenes cut out of it. Fragments remaining. His car, a lobby, the elevator. Me, apparently, agreeing to something. What did I agree to? I asked. He set down his coffee mug on the counter behind him, with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing their next words. Do you want breakfast first? What did I agree to? Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, exactly. More like assessment. You agreed to marry me. The room was very quiet for a very long moment. I want to be very clear, I said slowly, that I have never in my life agreed to marry anyone. I'm 28. I work in fundraising. I have a cat named Biscotti and a lease that's up in March and a TFSA that I'm supposed to be contributing to, but keep forgetting about. And not one single part of my life currently includes marrying a man whose last name I barely knew before last night. Biscotti, he repeated, and something in his voice shifted slightly, like this detail had caught him off guard in a way that the rest of my speech hadn't. Where is she now? He's at my apartment. With my neighbor who has a spare key and feeds him when I have evening events. I paused. Which is not relevant. I think it might be relevant to you. Don't, I said. Try to be charming right now. It's not going to work. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. More like the suggestion of one, quickly reconsidered. I stood up. My legs held, which felt like a victory. I'm going to get dressed, and then I'm going to leave. And whatever happened last night, whatever you think I agreed to, I want you to understand that it isn't binding. I was at a work event. I might have been. I don't know what was in that champagne. You had 2 glasses, he said. I watched. You were not incapacitated. You were. He paused, choosing. Unusually candid. Candid. You told me the gallery's strategic plan was ambitious in the way that plans written by committees are ambitious, which is to say it's technically a plan. I closed my eyes briefly. That did sound like something I would say. I had very specific opinions about the strategic plan. You also told me, he continued, that the Harrington family donation came with 17 conditions, the most absurd of which required us to display their patriarch's portrait in the main hall, quote, at eye level with a person of average height, but above eye level for children, so that adults found it welcoming and children found it aspirational. I opened my eyes. That's true. I know. I found it very funny. It's not funny. It's exhausting. I know that too. He looked at me steadily. You're not what I expected. I'm not your fiancé, I said. That's what I am right now. Someone who is not your fiancé and is going home. My name is Piper Sutton. I grew up in New Westminster, studied arts administration at UBC, and I have spent the last 4 years working at the gallery in a role that I love about 60% of the time and find soul-crushingly bureaucratic the other 40. I am practical in the way that people who grew up without much money tend to be practical. I comparison shop. I track my spending in a notes app. I know exactly how much my rent is going up next year, and I have opinions about it. I am not the kind of person things happen to. I am the kind of person who makes lists. So when I got home that morning, after retrieving my coat from the coat check, taking a cab I couldn't really afford, because I wasn't in a state to navigate the SkyTrain, and letting myself into my apartment to find Biscotti sitting on the kitchen counter, with the specific expression of a cat who has been lied to about breakfast timing, I sat down at my kitchen table and I made a list. What I knew, I was at the gala. I spoke to Kellen Voss. I do not remember agreeing to marry him. I woke up in his apartment in someone else's nightgown. My bag was intact. Nothing felt wrong in my body, which meant nothing had happened that I needed to process in a different kind of way, and I was grateful for that with a relief so specific it made my hands shake a little when I reached for my tea. What I didn't know, what exactly I'd said, why he believed it, what he actually wanted. That last one was the one I kept coming back to. Kellen Voss did not need to marry a gallery fundraising coordinator. Kellen Voss moved in circles where people married other people from those same circles, or at the very least people whose family money gave them a certain gravitational weight. I had no gravitational weight. I had student debt I'd finally finished paying off last year, and a very good eye for grant applications. So what was this? My phone buzzed. Unknown number, Vancouver area code. I answered before I'd thought about it. Hello? You left without eating. His voice low and unhurried. That bothers me more than it should. How did you get this number? Your card was on my desk. You gave it to me last night when we were talking about the gallery. That was frustratingly reasonable. I handed out my card constantly at events. It was reflex. I'm not your fiancé, I said again. You said that this morning. I'm saying it again for clarity. A pause. Could we have breakfast? I'd like to explain some things. I don't think breakfast is a good idea. I have a proposition, a real one. Not. A brief pause. Not whatever you're imagining. I looked at Biscotti. He blinked at me slowly, which meant either he trusted me or he wanted to be fed. You have 20 minutes, I said. We met at a cafe on Granville, which felt like neutral ground. He was already there when I arrived, which told me he'd left his building immediately after calling me, or he'd been very confident I'd say yes. I suspected the latter. I ordered a latte and a plain croissant because I wasn't going to let him buy me a real meal. He ordered black coffee and nothing, which somehow made him look more dangerous rather than less. My family, he said without preamble, has been pressuring me to marry for 4 years. Specifically, they want me to marry someone from within our, he considered his word choice, circle of business associates. What kind of business associates? His eyes met mine. The kind who have specific ideas about how alliances work. It wasn't an answer. It was also somehow a complete answer. You're not in the gallery business, I said slowly. No, and you don't want to marry someone from that circle. Not the person they have in mind. No, I turned my coffee cup. So last night, that was. What, you saw an opportunity? I saw someone interesting, he said. And then you said something that made me think you might be the kind of person who could make a decision quickly and hold to it, which is a rarer quality than people think. A pause. And then you suggested it. I stared at him. I suggested it. You did. What were my exact words? He looked at me for a long moment. You said, and I'm not embellishing, the easiest solution to a political marriage problem is to show up already married to someone they'd never have chosen, because it's very hard to argue with a fait accompli. I sat back. That was absolutely something I would say. I had a specific habit of solving hypothetical problems out loud, without realizing I'd started doing it. My former flatmate had called it monologuing at the problem. I'd been doing it since university. And you just agreed? I asked if you were serious. What did I say? You said, I'm always serious about hypotheticals. The corner of his mouth moved again, that almost smile. And then you said you'd do it if we drew up proper terms and you didn't have to quit your job. Those are very specific conditions for someone who was being hypothetical. Yes, he said. That's what I thought. I was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Granville Street was filling up with morning foot traffic. Someone with a dog, a woman pushing a stroller, 2 UBC students who looked like they hadn't slept. Vancouver in October, gray sky, wet pavement, that particular smell of rain on cedar that I'd grown up with and didn't notice anymore unless I was paying attention. What exactly would this involve? I asked. Appearances, events, enough to make it credible. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. A real legal arrangement with an exit clause. Compensation structured however you prefer. And your life, your actual life, remains entirely yours. What does your family do? I said carefully. That makes this necessary. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, logistics. Import. The kind of business that's been in the family long enough that the lines between legal and otherwise have become geological. Old enough to be structural. Old enough to be structural, I repeated. Yes, and the person they want you to marry. Her name is Katerina. Her father runs a competing operation out of Montreal. The marriage would consolidate certain interests. His jaw tightened, very slightly. I have no interest in consolidating those particular interests. I thought about this for a long moment. I thought about my lease ending in March, and the new rate my landlord had quoted me, and the fact that I'd been doing the mental math on whether I could actually afford to renew it, or whether I needed to look at New Westminster again. Or Surrey, which would add 40 minutes to my commute each way. I thought about the fact that I was very, very good at appearing to belong in rooms where I technically didn't belong. I'd been doing it for 4 years. I thought about the way he'd said, someone interesting, and meant it. I want to see your terms in writing before I agree to anything, I said. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded document. 4 pages, dense text. A lawyer's work, not a last-minute improvisation. I looked at him. You had this prepared. I had it prepared after you left this morning, he said. I had 2 hours. That's either very efficient or very alarming. Probably both. He slid it across the table. Take it home. Read it. If you want changes, write them in the margins. I picked it up, held it. It had the weight of something that was going to matter. This doesn't mean I'm agreeing, I said. I know. It means I'm reading. I know that too. I put it in my bag next to my own business cards. Then I finished my croissant because I hadn't eaten since yesterday evening, and I was hungry, and I wasn't going to pretend I wasn't. I read it twice at my kitchen table while Biscotti sat on the corner of the document, and occasionally tried to chew on page 3. The terms were not what I expected. A monthly stipend that would have made my landlord's new rate feel like background noise. A clear duration, 12 months, with an option to extend by mutual agreement. A list of required appearances, roughly 2 per month, nothing daily, nothing that would interfere with my work schedule in any structural way. An exit clause with 30 days written notice, no fault, no penalty, legal separation handled discreetly, and at his expense whenever we triggered it. There was a clause about the apartment. He was offering to maintain it, not give it to me, maintain it, a distinction that felt important, for the duration of the arrangement, so I didn't have to navigate the March lease situation under financial pressure. There was a clause, carefully worded, about his business. that his activities were his own, that I bore no legal liability for anything related to the family operation, and that if I ever felt unsafe, the arrangement terminated immediately, and he would provide whatever support I needed to relocate. That clause gave me pause. Not because it frightened me, because it had been thought about. Someone had thought to write that in and meant it. I picked up my pen. I read page 3 again, where Biscotti had left a small dent. I crossed out one sentence about social media. I had very specific opinions about my own social media presence, and I wasn't going to hand them over, and wrote a replacement in the margin. I added a line about my cat, which I was aware was probably ridiculous, but I wrote it anyway, something about maintaining the right to discuss him without restriction. I added a clause about my family, who lived in New Westminster, and whom I saw for dinner every other Sunday, and who were not going to become props in whatever this was. Then I sat for a long time looking at the ceiling. The thing about being practical is that you know when the practical calculation has already resolved itself, and you're just waiting to stop arguing with it. I picked up my phone. He answered on the second ring. 2 changes to page 3, I said. And I want to add a writer about my family dinners. A pause. What about them? They're not part of the arrangement. I wasn't going to suggest. I know. I want it in writing anyway. All right. His voice had shifted slightly. Something in it that might have been relief, or might have been something else I didn't have a name for yet. I'll have the revised version to you by end of day. One more thing, I said. Yes, my cat's name is Biscotti. If you ever meet him, you have to pretend you think that's a reasonable name for a cat, because I will not hear otherwise. The silence on the other end lasted exactly long enough for me to wonder if I'd miscalculated. Then, that is an entirely reasonable name for a cat. It's after the biscuit, I assumed. He's orange. Of course he is. I looked at Biscotti, who was now lying on page 4, and purring at a frequency that suggested he had absolutely no concerns about the direction my life was taking. Okay, I said. Send me the revision. The first event was a fundraiser dinner at the Hotel Vancouver. The real one. The old one on Georgia Street with the copper roof. For a foundation I'd actually heard of, which meant I spent part of the evening knowing people, and part of it pretending I didn't notice the looks. People looked. I was beginning to understand the point. Kellen introduced me simply, by name, with a hand at the small of my back that managed to communicate possession without being obvious about it, which was an impressive piece of non-verbal communication, and I tried not to think about it too much. An older woman named Mrs. Carmichael. I had no context for who she was except that everyone around her acted like they did, looked at me for a long moment and then said, "And where are you from, Piper?" "New Westminster," I said. "Grew up there. Went to UBC. I work at the gallery." "The art gallery?" "Yes." She looked at Kellen. "She's in the arts." "She runs fundraising," Kellen said, with a tone of voice that made this sound like something. "She's very good at it." Mrs. Carmichael looked back at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. "I'm sure she is," she said, and moved on. I leaned slightly toward Kellen afterward, low enough that no one else would hear. "What was that?" "Assessment," he said, equally low. "Did I pass?" She didn't leave immediately. "That's the best you're going to get from her tonight." I filed this information and kept smiling. His cousin found us near the bar, a man named Frederick, who was approximately Kellen's age, and had the look of someone who'd been told he was very charming since childhood and had never questioned it. He shook my hand and held it slightly longer than necessary and said, "So you're the one who finally convinced him?" "I didn't convince him of anything," I said. "It was mutual." Frederick laughed. Kellen's hand pressed slightly at my back. "She's not wrong," Kellen said. "No," Frederick said, studying me with something behind his eyes that wasn't quite the easy charm he was performing. "I don't imagine she is." The call came 3 weeks into the arrangement. I was at my desk at the gallery, reviewing a grant application, when my phone lit up with Kellen's name. We'd developed a system, a short text before calling, just so it wasn't a surprise, and there was no text preceding this. "Something's happened," he said when I answered. "What kind of something?" "The kind that requires you to not be alone tonight." A pause. "I'm going to explain everything, but I need to do it in person. Can you come to the apartment?" I looked at my grant application. I looked at the clock. "Can you give me 90 minutes?" "Yes, I'll be there." I finished the section I was working on. I sent 3 emails. I told my colleague Danielle that I had a personal thing and left at 5:15, which was 15 minutes earlier than I usually left, and which Danielle clocked with the raised eyebrow of someone who had been waiting for me to have a personal thing for years. When I got to his building, the doorman, his name was Ray, I'd learned, and he had a daughter at Langara, let me up without calling ahead. Kellen was standing by the window when I came in. The city behind him was starting to go orange in the late afternoon light, the mountains doing their particular October trick of looking both close and impossibly remote. He turned around when he heard the elevator open, and something in his face was different. "Tighter. Sit down," he said. "Please." I sat. "What happened?" He stayed standing. Katerina's father, Mikhail Sauvé, the one from Montreal. He made a trip to Vancouver. He knows about you. He had someone looking into my activities, personal and otherwise, for some time, apparently, and he was unhappy about the development. How unhappy? Unhappy enough to make it clear that he considered this a disruption to an arrangement he viewed as settled. I thought about this. He thought you'd marry Katerina. Both families thought so, for a long time. He looked at me steadily. I should have told you more at the beginning. I was trying to give you enough information without. I didn't want to scare you off before you'd decided. Okay, I said. He blinked. Okay? That was probably a reasonable call, I said. I might have said no if you'd led with it. I paused. What does unhappy actually mean in this context? It means someone followed you from the gallery yesterday. The room went very still. I thought about yesterday. My walk to the SkyTrain. The platform at Burrard. The 2-stop ride. The grocery stop on my way home. Biscotti on the counter. My evening, which had felt completely ordinary. Is that a threat? It's a message. A we're watching kind of message, not a direct one. His jaw was tight. It won't escalate unless I give them reason. But I wanted you to know. I sat with this for a moment. With the specific feeling of your own ordinary life, having been observed by someone who had reasons to observe it. What do you need from me? I asked. He looked at me for a moment like the question surprised him. Nothing. I'm handling it. I just didn't want you to not know. Okay. I thought for a moment. If someone followed me from the gallery, they know where I work. Yes. They probably know where I live. Yes, and my family. My voice stayed flat. My parents are in New Westminster. I know. He stopped. Started again. I have people watching the area. Not intrusively, just awareness. Something moved through me that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger, but was made of the same material as both. My parents' house on 13th Avenue, the one with the garden my mother kept, and the recycling bin my father put out every Thursday. Ordinary. Untouched by any of this. You should have told me more, I said. Yes, that's not a hypothetical criticism. That's a condition going forward. I know. A pause. I'm sorry. I looked at him. He said it like someone who didn't say it often, which somehow made it land differently. Okay, I said again. So what happens now? Now, he said, we go to dinner. Somewhere visible. We act like this is all completely fine. Because the best message we can send is that nothing has rattled us. And then, his voice shifted slightly, something deliberate about his tone. Tomorrow I have a meeting, and this starts to resolve itself. What kind of meeting? He looked at me for long enough that I understood he was making a decision about how much to tell me. The kind where I explain clearly that the previous arrangement was never mine to keep, and that the current one is. He paused. And that anyone who makes my wife uncomfortable will find that a more significant problem than they expected. I sat with that word for a moment, wife. Strange to hear it said out loud. We'd been avoiding it, mostly. Kellen. He looked at me. I'm not actually your wife, I know, but, he agreed. We looked at each other for a moment in the quiet of the apartment, with the mountains going dark in the windows, and the city lights just starting to come up below us. Fine, I said. Let's go to dinner. We had dinner at a restaurant on West 4th that I'd walked past 100 times and never been inside, because the menu in the window made my credit card anxious. Kellen ordered wine I didn't ask the price of, which was its own small adjustment I was making to this version of my life. I ordered the halibut. It was very good. I thought about my parents and the recycling bin and my mother's dahlias that she put in the ground every June. Tell me about your parents, Kellen said. I looked up. You don't have to, he said. I'd like to know, I told him. My father who'd retired from BC Hydro, and now filled his time with woodworking, and an unreasonable number of opinions about the Whitecaps. My mother, who'd worked at the school board and still did occasional consulting, and made food in large quantities, whether or not there were people around to eat it. The house I grew up in, which was the same house, the Dahlia Garden, Sunday dinners. He listened the way people who are used to being listened to don't always remember how to do. Like my words were landing somewhere. My parents both died before I was 25, he said when I'd finished. My uncle handled everything after, the business, the family, all of it. A pause. He means well. He doesn't understand that meaning well and doing right are not always the same thing. No, I said, they're not. He turned his wine glass slowly. This wasn't what I planned. Whatever last night was, whatever you said that started it, I want you to know I didn't engineer it. I believe you, I said. And I did, which surprised me slightly, 'cause I was not typically a quick trust person. I think I engineered it accidentally, which is honestly on brand for me. He almost smiled again. I was getting better at recognizing it. Accidentally. I have a habit, I said, of solving problems out loud, usually for other people. I think last night I temporarily applied it to your problem, which, to be fair, you did lay out very clearly. You were very interested in the problem. I'm a fundraiser. We're structurally inclined toward solutions. He did smile then. Fully, for the first time I'd seen. Something that changed his face completely. Took the unsettling quality out of it, replaced it with something that looked startlingly like warmth. Piper, he said, and it was the first time he'd said my name directly like that, not in introduction, just to me. Don't, I said. I haven't said anything. You were about to say something that was going to make this complicated. He was quiet for a moment. Probably, he conceded. Good. Then we're on the same page. We were not, I suspected, on the same page. But the halibut was excellent, and the wine was whatever it was. And through the window I could see Burrard Street in the dark, wet, and familiar. And I was still here in this city, in this life which had turned itself inside out in the space of 3 weeks, and was somehow still mine. He paid. Of course he paid. On the sidewalk outside, the October rain had started again. Not hard, just Vancouver's particular habit of making the air itself damp, the kind of rain that isn't really falling so much as existing everywhere at once. I'll have a car take you home, he said. I'm fine on the SkyTrain, Piper. I am categorically fine on the SkyTrain. I have been taking the SkyTrain since I was 16. He looked at me for a long moment. The streetlights were doing something specific to the rain. At least let me walk you to the station. I considered this. 2 blocks, I said. 2 blocks, he agreed. We walked. He didn't take my hand or do anything that required acknowledgement. He just walked next to me in the Vancouver rain on a Tuesday night in October. Like it was a thing we'd done before, like it might be a thing we'd do again. At the SkyTrain entrance, I turned to say goodbye and found him looking at me with that expression I still didn't quite have a name for. Hey, I said. Hey, tomorrow's meeting. Yes, be careful, I said. Not because of the arrangement, just, in general. He was quiet for a moment. You know, he said. For someone who didn't agree to any of this, you're taking it remarkably seriously. I take most things seriously, I said. It's a flaw. I don't think it is. The rain sat between us for a moment. Good night, Kellen. Good night, he said. And then, quiet enough that I almost didn't catch it, Sutton. I was already through the doors before I processed that. Sutton. A version of my name that no one called me. Something private in it, almost accidental, like he hadn't quite meant to say it out loud. I thought about it all the way home on the train, through the tunnel under the inlet, watching my own reflection in the dark window. Biscotti was waiting on the doormat when I let myself in, which was his specific way of registering complaint about dinner timing. I know, I said. Me too, I fed him. I changed out of my heels. I sat on my couch in the November-adjacent quiet of my apartment, in the city I'd grown up next to and chosen to stay in this life that had gotten very strange very quickly, and I thought about the way someone had said my name like it was something they'd decided to keep. I didn't know what came next, but I'd been wrong about that before, about knowing what was next, and maybe that wasn't the flaw I'd always treated it as. Maybe not knowing was just the beginning of a problem worth solving. I picked up the grant application I'd brought home in my bag. I had notes to finish. I got to work.